Twin girls vanished while playing outside. 8 years later, Dad looks under neighbor's dog kennel. Richard Keller's hands trembled as he stared at the weathered wooden planks of the dog kennel floor. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the gaps, casting thin beams across his weathered face as sweat trickled down his temples. 8 years of searching, of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers, had led him to this moment, to his neighbor's backyard, to this unassuming structure where a German shepherd had lived until just 3 weeks ago. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted an unusual discoloration in the soil beneath a loose board. With shaking fingers, he pried up the plank, revealing what appeared to be the corner of a small, pink fabric, a material he recognized instantly. The same cotton pattern from the matching dresses his twin daughters had been wearing the day they vanished without a trace. "Oh God," he whispered, bile rising in his throat. "Martha, Martha." But this moment, this discovery that would shake a small Virginia town to its core, was merely the culmination of a tragedy that had begun on a perfect spring day 8 years earlier, when two little girls with identical smiles decided to play hide-and-seek in their front yard. April 15, 2017. Ready or not, here I come. 7-year-old Emily Keller covered her eyes with her small hands, counting loudly enough for her twin sister Sarah to hear from wherever she might be hiding. The front yard of their modest colonial-style home in Cedar Brook, Virginia buzzed with the sounds of spring, birds chirping, a neighbor's lawnmower humming in the distance, children's laughter floating from other yards down the street. The twins' mother, Martha Keller, watched from the kitchen window as she prepared lunch, her hands moving methodically through the ritual of sandwich making while keeping an eye on her daughters. The girls were identical in almost every way, same honey blonde hair styled in matching braids, same button noses dusted with freckles, same pink gingham dresses she'd sewn herself. Only their personalities distinguished them. Emily the bold leader, Sarah the thoughtful follower. Martha smiled as Emily began searching behind the hydrangea bushes, while Sarah, no doubt, had found a clever hiding spot. The girls knew the rules: stay in the front yard, don't go near the street, don't go into anyone else's yard. Rules they'd followed faithfully for the past year since they'd been allowed to play outside without direct supervision. At 7, they were responsible girls, mature for their age. Martha felt that familiar parental mix of pride and worry as she finished cutting the crusts off their sandwiches. Outside, Emily had checked all the usual spots, behind the oak tree, under the porch swing, beside the mailbox. Frustration creased her small brow as she planted her hands on her hips in a gesture that mimicked her mother's. "Sarah, you're too good at hiding," she called out, spinning in a circle to survey the yard again. "I give up." But there was no response. No triumphant giggle, no rustle of movement from a previously unnoticed hiding spot. Just the background noise of suburban spring and the suddenly louder pounding of Emily's heart. "Sarah," she called again, her voice higher now. "You win, come out now." Martha noticed the change in Emily's tone immediately. Mother's intuition, that inexplicable sixth sense, sent a cold shiver down her spine before her conscious mind could even process what was happening. She set down the knife, wiped her hands quickly on a dish towel, and moved briskly to the front door. "Girls, lunch is ready," she called, stepping onto the porch, expecting to see two identical heads pop up from behind some shrub or garden feature. Instead, she saw only Emily, now frantically running around the yard, her little voice growing more panicked with each call of her sister's name. "Sarah's hiding too good, Mommy," Emily said, looking up at Martha with wide, worried eyes. "I can't find her anywhere." Martha's heart rate quickened, but she maintained her calm exterior. "Sarah Keller, lunch is ready. Come out right now, please," she called with the authoritative tone that usually brought immediate compliance. Silence. "Maybe she went around back," Martha suggested, already moving to check, her walk quickening to a jog as she rounded the corner of the house. 10 minutes later, after searching every inch of their property, Martha's composure cracked. She rushed inside to call her husband Richard at his construction job site, then the police, her voice breaking as she uttered the words no parent ever imagines saying, "My daughter is missing." What Martha couldn't have known, what would haunt the family for years to come, was that Emily had witnessed something in those brief moments when she'd had her eyes closed and was counting. Something her 7-year-old mind couldn't process properly. something that would eventually become the first crucial piece in a puzzle that would take 8 long years to complete. Detective Marcus Washington arrived at the Keller home 20 minutes after Martha's call, by which time Richard had already raced home from his job site, still wearing his dust-covered work clothes and steel-toed boots. The couple stood on their front lawn, Richard with his arm around Martha's trembling shoulders, both looking shell-shocked as neighbors began gathering in small clusters at the edges of the property. At 43, Washington had been with the Cedar Brook Police Department for 15 years, the last 7 as a detective. With his salt-and-pepper hair, broad shoulders, and steady gaze, he projected an air of competence that instantly commanded respect. But there was a gentleness in his eyes, too, the compassion of a man who had seen too much suffering and still managed to care deeply. "Mr. and Mrs. Keller," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Detective Washington. I understand your daughter Sarah is missing." Richard nodded, his face ashen. She was playing hide-and-seek with her sister in the front yard. That was, he checked his watch, an hour ago now. "We've looked everywhere," Martha added, her voice hoarse. "The entire property, the neighbors' yards, she's just gone." Washington nodded, making notes in a small pad. "And Emily was with her the whole time." "Yes, until they started playing hide-and-seek," Martha explained. "Emily was counting, and when she opened her eyes, Sarah was gone." The detective turned his attention to Emily, who sat on the porch steps, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her small face blank with shock. He approached slowly and crouched down to her level. "Hi there, Emily. I'm Detective Washington, but you can call me Marcus if you want. I'm here to help find your sister. Do you think you could tell me what happened when you were playing?" Emily looked up at him, her blue eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. "I counted to 20. I was hiding my eyes," she demonstrated by covering her face with her hands. "And when I said ready or not, Sarah was gone." "Did you hear anything while you were counting? Maybe a car or someone talking?" Emily's brow furrowed in concentration. "I heard Mr. Peterson's lawnmower," she pointed toward a house 3 doors down, "and a dog barking, and—" She hesitated, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. "And what, sweetheart?" Washington encouraged gently. "A door closing, like a car door but different, heavier." Washington made a note. "That's very helpful, Emily. Did you see anyone in the yard or on the street before you started counting?" Emily shook her head, then paused. "Wait, there was a truck, a big white truck parked over there." She pointed toward the street corner. "I didn't see anyone in it, though." As Washington continued interviewing Emily, another police car arrived, followed by 2 more. The next few hours unfolded in a blur of activity, officers canvassing the neighborhood, questioning neighbors, searching yards and garages. By nightfall, the search had expanded to include K-9 units, volunteers from the community, and a helicopter equipped with a thermal imaging camera. But there was no sign of Sarah Keller. Back at the house, Richard paced the living room like a caged animal, occasionally stopping to stare out the window at the search teams combing the area with flashlights. Martha sat rigidly on the couch, holding Emily, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. The girl's cheeks were tear-stained, her small body occasionally twitching with the aftermath of sobbing. "Someone took her," Richard said, his voice low and raw. "Someone came into our yard and took our little girl." Martha looked up at him, her face a mask of anguish. "But who would do that? Why Sarah? Why us?" Detective Washington, who had remained at the house as a command center was established, stepped into the room with a fresh cup of coffee for each of the parents. "We're pursuing all possibilities, Mr. Keller," he said, "but I need to ask you both some difficult questions now." Richard nodded grimly, taking the offered coffee. "Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt your family?" Richard shook his head. "No, nothing like that. I run a small construction company. Martha teaches 3rd grade at Cedar Brook Elementary. We're just normal people." "Any financial troubles? Debts? Anyone who might have a grudge against either of you?" "No," Martha whispered. "Nothing." Washington nodded, making notes. "Any unusual phone calls or encounters recently? Someone showing too much interest in the girls, perhaps?" The parents exchanged a look, then both shook their heads. "What about family? Any custody disputes or relatives who might have taken Sarah, even if just as a misguided attempt to see her?" No, Richard said firmly. My parents are deceased. Martha's live in Florida and we spoke to them an hour ago. They're flying in tomorrow. We have a sister in California and a brother in Maine. No disputes, no issues. Washington nodded again, his face revealing nothing. I have to ask, and please understand this is standard procedure. Where were each of you today? Richard's face hardened, but he answered evenly. I was at a construction site in Westfield all day with a crew of 15 men. Martha was here with the girls, and then at the grocery store for about an hour this morning. I took both girls with me to the store, Martha added, her voice barely audible. We got home around 11. The girls asked to play outside after lunch. I was in the kitchen the whole time, watching them through the window. Washington's expression softened slightly. Thank you. Again, these are standard questions we have to ask in every case. He hesitated, then continued. There's something else you should know. We found tire tracks on the edge of your yard near where Emily said she saw the white truck. We've made casts of them. Also, one of your neighbors, Mrs. Cleary across the street, reported seeing an unfamiliar white utility van parked on the corner earlier today. Richard's head snapped up. A white van, not a truck. That's what she reported. We're canvassing for any security cameras in the area that might have captured an image. Martha suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Sullivan house. They installed one of those video doorbells last month. You can see our front yard from their porch. Washington was immediately on his feet. I'll have someone check on that right away. As he stepped outside to radio this information, the weight of what was happening seemed to crash down on Richard all at once. His little girl was gone, taken by someone, somewhere out in the night. He sank down onto the couch beside his wife and sleeping daughter, buried his face in his hands, and wept. What none of them realized was that Sarah's disappearance was only the beginning of a mystery that would consume their lives and divide their small community for years to come. And at the center of it all was a secret that had been buried beneath a neighbor's dog kennel. A secret that wouldn't be unearthed until one desperate father refused to stop searching, even when everyone else had given up hope. By dawn, the search for Sarah Keller had intensified. The FBI had been called in, setting up a command post in the Cedar Brook Elementary School gymnasium. Agent Lydia Chen, a specialist in child abductions with 15 years of experience, arrived with a team of 5 agents at 5:30 a.m. Chen was a striking presence, tall and lithe with an angular face that rarely betrayed emotion. At 49, she'd worked dozens of child abduction cases, some with happy endings, many without. The first 48 hours were critical, she knew. After that, the chances of finding a missing child alive dropped dramatically. The video doorbell footage from the Sullivan house had yielded their first solid lead. At 2:17 p.m., exactly when Sarah would have been hiding, a white Chevrolet van with no rear windows was visible at the edge of the frame, parked just where Emily had indicated. The license plate wasn't visible, but there was a distinctive dent on the driver's side door and what appeared to be a company logo that had been painted over, leaving a faint outline. We've got state police checking every white Chevy van registered within a 100-mile radius, Washington informed Chen as they stood over a map of Cedar Brook in the gymnasium. And we're cross-referencing with any reports of suspicious activity involving similar vehicles. Chen nodded, studying the map intently. What about sex offenders in the area? 17 registered within a 20-mile radius. We've already checked in on 12, all accounted for and with alibis we're verifying. Teams are tracking down the remaining 5. In the Keller home, morning arrived without the usual sounds of twin girls chattering as they prepared for school. Instead, Martha sat at the kitchen table, mechanically filling out forms provided by the FBI, detailed descriptions of Sarah's appearance, medical history, distinguishing marks. Her hands shook as she wrote down small crescent-shaped birthmark behind right ear and recently lost right front tooth. Richard had spent most of the night driving through neighboring areas, searching abandoned buildings, alleys, anywhere a child might be hidden. He'd returned home just before dawn, hollow-eyed and disheveled, only to shower and prepare to go out searching again. Emily had woken at first light, momentarily confused about why she was on the couch instead of in her bed. Then remembrance had flooded her small features, and she'd asked in a small, frightened voice, "Did they find Sarah yet?" The heartbreak of having to tell her no had nearly shattered Martha. Now, Emily sat in the living room with a victim services counselor who had arrived with the FBI team, drawing pictures that the woman gently encouraged her to explain. "Can you tell me about this?" the counselor asked, pointing to a drawing of what appeared to be a person standing near a box-like shape. "That's the man with the big dog," Emily said matter-of-factly. "Sarah was scared of him." The counselor kept her voice neutral. "What man with a dog, Emily?" "The man who lives down the street. He has a big dog that barks all the time. Sarah doesn't like walking past his house." This information was immediately relayed to Detective Washington, who was already compiling a list of everyone living within a 5-block radius of the Keller home. 3 houses down and across the street lived Gerald Wilson, a 57-year-old retired mechanic who did indeed own a German Shepherd named Rex. Wilson had lived in Cedar Brook for almost 30 years, a fixture in the neighborhood known for his meticulous yard and occasional grumbling about the noise from children playing. When Detectives Washington and his partner, Detective Brenda Rodriguez, knocked on Wilson's door at 9:15 a.m., he answered wearing oil-stained jeans and a flannel shirt despite the warm spring weather. His weathered face registered first surprise, then wariness at the sight of the officers. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Detective Washington and this is Detective Rodriguez. We're investigating the disappearance of Sarah Keller. May we come in and ask you a few questions?" Wilson hesitated, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "The little girl who went missing yesterday? Terrible thing. Sure, come in." The interior of Wilson's home was spotless, almost obsessively organized. Model cars lined glass shelves in the living room, each positioned at precisely the same angle. The furniture was dated but well-maintained, and despite the cleanliness, the house smelled strongly of dog and motor oil. "Where's your dog?" Rodriguez asked, noticing the empty cushion in the corner that clearly belonged to a large animal. "Rex is out back in his kennel, gets too excited with visitors," Wilson replied, gesturing for them to sit. "What can I help you with?" Washington remained standing, his trained eye scanning the room. "Can you tell us where you were yesterday afternoon, specifically between 2:00 and 3:00 p.m.? Wilson's expression remained neutral. "Right here. I was rebuilding a carburetor for my Mustang, been working on it all week in the garage." "Can anyone verify that?" Rodriguez asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "No, I live alone. Haven't had anyone over in days." Wilson crossed his arms. "You don't think I had anything to do with that little girl going missing, do you?" Washington smiled thinly. "We're talking to everyone in the neighborhood, Mr. Wilson. Standard procedure." He paused, then asked, "Do you own a white van by any chance?" Something flickered in Wilson's eyes, so brief Washington almost missed it. "No, I have a black Ford F-150 and a '67 Mustang I'm restoring. That's it." "Mind if we take a look in your garage and backyard?" Rodriguez asked casually. Now Wilson's demeanor changed perceptibly. He straightened, his jaw tightening. "Do you have a warrant, Detective?" Washington and Rodriguez exchanged a glance. "No, sir, we don't, but we're trying to find a missing 7-year-old girl, if you have nothing to hide." "I know my rights," Wilson interrupted. "I've answered your questions. I wasn't involved in whatever happened to that kid. Now, unless you have a warrant, I'd like you to leave." The detectives had no choice but to comply, but Washington handed Wilson his card before leaving. "If you think of anything that might help, please call me directly, day or night." As they walked back to their car, Rodriguez murmured, "He's hiding something." Washington nodded grimly. "Let's run a deep background check and get a surveillance team on him, and let's see how fast we can get a warrant." By nightfall on the second day, Sarah's disappearance had made national news. Reporters crowded the street in front of the Keller home, their satellite trucks and camera equipment creating an incongruous media village in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Inside, Richard and Martha sat side by side on their couch as Agent Chen prepared them for a press conference. "Appeal directly to whoever took Sarah," Chen advised, her voice gentle but firm. "Humanize her. Make them see her as a child who needs to come home, not as an object or a commodity." Martha nodded, clutching a recent school photo of Sarah. The image showed a smiling child with bright eyes and a missing front tooth, her blonde hair neatly braided, the spitting image of Emily, who was now staying with Martha's sister who had flown in from California. "And if they've hurt her?" Richard asked, his voice breaking on the words. Chen met his gaze steadily. "Then we'll deal with that when we find them, but right now we focus on bringing Sarah home. That's all that matters." The press conference was brief but emotional. Martha, summoning strength from some deep maternal reserve, spoke directly to the camera, her voice clear despite her tears. "To whoever has our daughter, please, Sarah needs her medicine for her asthma. She needs her family. She has a twin sister who's heartbroken without her. We just want her home safe. You can drop her off at any hospital, any police station, no questions asked. Please, just let our little girl come home." It was a lie. Sarah didn't have asthma, but it was a tactic Chen had suggested. Give the abductor an out, a way to return the child while saving face, and create a medical urgency that might prompt action. As Martha spoke, Richard sat beside her, a pillar of silent anguish, his eyes fixed on the photo of his missing daughter that was now being broadcast to millions of homes across America. What the cameras didn't capture was the moment after, when the microphones were turned off and Martha collapsed into her husband's arms, whispering the same 3 words over and over. "Find her, please." In the days that followed, the investigation proceeded along multiple fronts. The white van became the primary focus, with every matching vehicle within a 100-mile radius stopped and searched. Gerald Wilson remained a person of interest, though the warrant to search his property revealed nothing suspicious. His alibi couldn't be confirmed, but neither could any evidence be found linking him to Sarah's disappearance. Other leads emerged, were investigated, and ultimately discarded. A waitress at a truck stop 50 miles north thought she'd seen a man with a young blonde girl who seemed distressed. Security footage revealed it was a different child with her grandfather. A convicted child molester was found to have moved to Cedar Brook under a false name, but he had been in the hospital undergoing kidney dialysis the day Sarah vanished. Each dead end hit the Keller family like a physical blow. With each passing day, hope dimmed a little more, though neither Richard nor Martha would ever admit it aloud. Emily, meanwhile, suffered from nightmares and had begun refusing to leave the house. The once vivacious child had become withdrawn, speaking little and staying close to her mother at all times. Child psychologists brought in by the FBI worked with her daily, both to help her cope and to try to extract any additional details she might remember about the day her sister disappeared. It was during one of these sessions, a week after the abduction, that Emily revealed something new. "I saw the white van before," she said quietly as she colored a picture of 2 girls holding hands. "It was parked near our school. The man was watching us." The psychologist, Dr. Marissa Patel, kept her voice casual even as her pulse quickened. "When was this, Emily?" "Last week or maybe the week before." Emily's concept of time, like most children her age, was still developing. "Sarah saw it too. She said the man in it looked mean." Dr. Patel gently encouraged Emily to describe the man, but the child could only offer vague details. He was old. Though to a 7-year-old that could mean anything over 30, had yellow hair and wore glasses. It wasn't much, but it was something new. The school's security cameras were immediately checked, but their limited coverage didn't include the street where Emily claimed to have seen the van. However, traffic cameras at an intersection 2 blocks away were able to capture vehicles approaching the school. Agents began the painstaking process of reviewing days of footage, looking for any white van that matched the description. 14 days after Sarah's disappearance, Detective Washington received a call that sent a chill through his body. A child's shoe, a small white sneaker with pink laces, had been found by a hiker in Stanton Woods, a nature preserve about 15 miles from Cedar Brook. Washington drove to the scene immediately, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The woods were a popular hiking spot, but dense enough that a body, he forced himself to think the word, could be hidden and not discovered for some time. The shoe was indeed a match for the one Sarah had been wearing when she disappeared. A massive search of the area commenced, with K-9 units, volunteers, and law enforcement combing every inch of the woods. They found nothing else. No second shoe, no clothing, no disturbed earth indicating a burial site. Just the single sneaker placed, not dropped but deliberately placed, on a fallen log beside the main trail. "It's a taunt," Agent Chen said when Washington called her. "Someone's playing games with us." "Or sending a message," Washington replied grimly. "Either way, we need to prepare the family." Telling the Kellers about the shoe was one of the hardest things Washington had ever done. Martha took one look at the evidence bag and positively identified it before breaking down completely. Richard simply walked out of the house without a word, got in his truck, and drove away. He didn't return for 6 hours, and when he did, his knuckles were bloody and swollen. The discovery of the shoe changed the tone of the investigation. While officially Sarah was still listed as missing, privately, the FBI agents and local detectives began preparing for the likelihood that they were now searching for a body rather than a living child. Emily, with the intuition that sometimes exists between twins, sensed this shift. That night, she crawled into her parents' bed, her small body shaking with sobs. "Sarah's not coming back, is she?" she asked, looking up at her mother with eyes too old for her 7 years. Martha gathered her daughter close, her own tears falling into Emily's hair. "We don't know that, baby. We have to keep hoping." But hope was becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. 1 month after Sarah's disappearance, the active search was scaled back. The FBI maintained a presence, but the command center at the school was dismantled. The media trucks departed one by one, moving on to the next tragedy in the never-ending news cycle. Cedar Brook began to return to a semblance of normalcy, though the community remained forever changed. Parents who once allowed their children to play freely in front yards now watched them with vigilant eyes or kept them indoors entirely. Neighbors who had barely known each other before now gathered for regular meetings about community safety. And everywhere, Sarah's face smiled out from posters that had begun to yellow and curl at the edges. For the Kellers, there was no return to normalcy. Their lives had been cleaved into 2 distinct periods, before and after. Before was filled with the joyful chaos of raising twin girls, with birthday parties and school projects and family movie nights. After was a barren landscape of grief, anger, and the terrible limbo of not knowing. Richard threw himself into the search, refusing to accept the official scaling back of operations. He took a leave of absence from his construction company and spent his days following up on tips, distributing flyers, and consulting with private investigators. At night, he pored over maps and files, looking for patterns or clues the authorities might have missed. Martha returned to teaching after 6 weeks, not out of readiness but financial necessity. Standing before her 3rd-grade classroom, looking at children the same age as her daughters, was its own special form of torture. But she persevered, finding that the structure and routine provided some small buffer against the overwhelming grief. Emily perhaps suffered the most profoundly. The psychological bond between twins is unique, and having half of herself suddenly vanish left the child unmoored. She developed severe separation anxiety, requiring therapy 3 times a week. She spoke of Sarah in the present tense always, and kept her sister's side of their shared bedroom exactly as it had been the day she disappeared, down to the half-finished drawing on the desk. Life continued in this fractured way for months, and then years. The seasons changed. Emily grew taller. The police files on Sarah's case grew thicker with leads that went nowhere. The Kellers' marriage, strained under the weight of their shared tragedy, nearly collapsed before slowly, painfully rebuilding itself around their new reality. And all the while, Gerald Wilson lived 3 houses down and across the street, walking his German shepherd, maintaining his meticulous yard, and watching the Keller house with an expression that could have been sympathy, curiosity, or something else entirely. April 15, 2021, 4 years after Sarah's disappearance. On the 4th anniversary of the day that had changed everything, Martha placed fresh flowers beside the small stone marker in their backyard. It wasn't a grave. They had no body to bury, but rather a memorial, a place to focus their grief and remembrance. Emily, now 11, stood beside her mother, holding a handmade card she'd created for her sister. The once identical twins would no longer be mirror images. Emily had grown taller, her features maturing, her baby teeth all replaced by permanent ones. Sarah, in their minds, remained forever 7. "Do you think she knows we're thinking about her?" Emily asked softly, placing the card against the stone. Martha wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, noticing how much taller she'd grown in the past year. I believe she does, sweetheart, wherever she is. They stood in silence for a few moments, the spring breeze rustling through the cherry tree Richard had planted beside the memorial. Then Martha gently guided Emily back toward the house. Come on, Dad's waiting. We should get going. Richard was in the kitchen, staring out the window with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. At 43, he looked considerably older than his years. His once dark hair was now liberally streaked with gray, and deep lines had etched themselves around his eyes and mouth. The past 4 years had hollowed him out, scraped away the easygoing man he'd once been, and left behind someone harder, more haunted. Every year on this anniversary, the family followed the same ritual. Flowers at the memorial, then a drive to the police station to check for any updates on the case, followed by lunch at Sarah's favorite pizza place, where they always ordered her preferred toppings, pepperoni and black olives, and left one slice untouched on a separate plate. Detective Washington, now a lieutenant, still made time to meet with them personally each year, though he had little new information to share. This year was no different. We still get tips occasionally, he told them, his own face showing the passage of years and the weight of an unsolved case that haunted him professionally and personally. Each one gets thoroughly investigated, and every few months we review the entire case file, looking at the evidence with fresh eyes. Richard nodded, having heard variations of this speech before. And Gerald Wilson, any chance of taking another look at him? Washington sighed. They'd had this conversation many times over the years. Richard, we've investigated Wilson extensively. Multiple interviews, searches of his property, background checks. There's simply no evidence linking him to Sarah's disappearance. He was home alone that day. No alibi, Richard insisted. And he lied about the van. He used to own a white Chevy van. I found the registration from 5 years ago, which he sold 18 months before Sarah disappeared, Washington reminded him gently, to a dealership in Richmond who resold it to a plumbing company in North Carolina. We tracked it down. It wasn't the van seen on the doorbell camera. Martha placed a hand on her husband's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Richard, please, not today. Something in her voice, the raw edge of grief barely contained, reached him, and he subsided, though the set of his jaw made it clear he wasn't convinced. As they left the station, Washington placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. We haven't given up, Richard. I promise you that. Sarah's file is never closed, never forgotten. Richard met the detective's eyes. I know that, Marcus, and I haven't given up either. I never will. November 18, 2023. 6.5 years after Sarah's disappearance. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, a plain white business envelope with the Keller's address typed on a label, no return address. Martha almost tossed it in with the junk mail, but something, the weight of it perhaps, made her pause and open it. Inside was a Polaroid photograph and a typed note consisting of 2 words, still alive. The photo showed a young teenage girl with blonde hair, sitting at a table with what appeared to be school books. Her face was partially turned away from the camera, but enough was visible to send Martha staggering backward until she hit the wall, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Richard, she screamed, her voice shattering the quiet afternoon. Richard. He came running from the garage where he'd been working, the panic in her voice bringing him at a dead sprint. What is it? Wordlessly, she held out the photo, her hand trembling violently. Richard took it, his face draining of color as he stared at the image. Is it? Could it be? The girl in the photo would be the right age, 13 now, and had the same blonde hair. But the partial profile wasn't enough for positive identification, especially after more than 6 years. They called Detective Washington immediately, and within an hour, their home was once again a hub of police activity. The photo and envelope were taken for forensic analysis. The FBI was notified, and the Kellers were left with a renewed hurricane of emotions, hope warring with fear, possibility battling with the pain of potential disappointment. It could be her, Richard kept saying, pacing the living room. It really could be her. Martha sat still as stone on the couch, her mind racing through possibilities. If Sarah was alive, where had she been all these years? What had she experienced? Had she been harmed, abused? The questions were almost as terrifying as the years of not knowing. Emily, now 13 and in 8th grade, came home from school to find police cars once again parked in front of their house. The familiar sight sent her racing inside, her backpack dropped forgotten on the front walk. "What happened?" she demanded, looking from her mother's stunned face to her father's feverish excitement. "Is it about Sarah?" Martha hesitated, then nodded. "Someone sent us a picture, honey. It might be Sarah, but we don't know for sure yet." Emily's response surprised them both. Instead of excitement or hope, her young face showed fear. "Can I see it?" Richard retrieved his phone, which contained a digital copy of the photo he'd taken before the original was confiscated. Emily studied it intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "That's not Sarah," she said finally, handing the phone back to her father. Richard and Martha exchanged a look of confusion tinged with concern. "How can you be sure, sweetheart?" Martha asked gently. "It's been so long and we can't see her full face." Emily shook her head firmly. "I just know that's not my sister." With that, she turned and went upstairs to her room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow conveyed more emotion than a slam. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Washington called with preliminary findings. The photo appeared to be recently taken, based on the condition of the Polaroid and items visible in the background. The envelope had no useful fingerprints, and the label had been printed on a type of printer commonly found in libraries and copy shops. In short, they had very little to go on. "It could be a cruel hoax," Washington said, his voice heavy. "We've seen it before in high-profile missing children cases, someone seeking attention or trying to exploit the family's pain." "Or it could really be her," Richard insisted. "We need age progression specialists to look at it, facial recognition." "Already in progress," Washington assured him. "I've sent everything to the FBI lab. They're giving it top priority." After hanging up, Richard found Martha in Sarah's bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed that had remained unchanged for over 6 years. The room was a time capsule of a 7-year-old girl, stuffed animals arranged on the pillows, a bookshelf filled with early reader books, walls decorated with colorful drawings. Martha came in weekly to dust, to maintain this shrine to their missing daughter, though they had long since converted the guest room into a more age-appropriate space for when, if Sarah returned. "Emily says it's not her," Martha said without looking up. "And she's never wrong about these things. She knew about the shoe before we told her. She knew when they stopped the active search. She has a connection." Richard sat beside his wife, taking her hand in his. "The FBI will tell us for sure." Martha finally turned to him, her eyes swimming with tears. "But what if it is her, Richard? What then? She wouldn't be our little girl anymore. She'd be a teenager who spent half her life somewhere else with someone else." Her voice broke on the last words. Richard had no answer for this. It was a fear he'd carried himself, that even if by some miracle Sarah was found alive, the damage done might be irreparable. That the joyful 7-year-old with the gap-toothed smile was gone forever, replaced by someone shaped by trauma they couldn't begin to comprehend. "One step at a time," he said finally, echoing the mantra their family therapist had given them years ago. "Right now, we just need to know if she's alive." 3 days later, they got their answer. The FBI's facial recognition analysis, though hampered by the partial profile, indicated that the girl in the photo was not Sarah Keller. This conclusion was supported by subtle differences in ear shape and the hairline, details that wouldn't change even with age. The news hit Richard the hardest. He'd allowed himself to hope, to truly believe for the first time in years that they might find Sarah alive. The confirmation that it was yet another dead end sent him spiraling into a depression deeper than any he'd experienced since the early days after her disappearance. For weeks he barely spoke, barely ate. He went through the motions of daily life like an automaton, his mind constantly cycling through the same questions. Where was Sarah? Was she even still alive? Would they ever know what happened to her? It was Emily who eventually pulled him back from the brink. One evening, she sat beside him on the porch swing where he'd taken to spending hours staring blankly at the street. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying the new maturity of early adolescence, "Sarah wouldn't want you to give up." Richard looked at his daughter, his only living daughter as far as he knew, and saw both the child she had been and the young woman she was becoming. And he saw something else. Sarah's eyes looking back at him from Emily's face, that same determined glint they'd shared as little girls. "I'm not giving up," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "I'll never give up." Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know, Dad. That's why she'll come home someday, because you won't stop looking." The moment marked a turning point for Richard. His grief and determination crystallized into something new, a cold, focused resolve. He would find Sarah, or at least find the truth of what had happened to her, no matter how long it took or what it cost him. He began methodically revisiting every aspect of the case, creating a dedicated office in their basement filled with maps, timelines, and files. He took courses in investigation techniques and forensic science. He joined national organizations for families of missing children, networking with others who understood his particular hell. And he began watching Gerald Wilson more closely than ever before. March 2, 2025, almost 8 years after Sarah's disappearance. The call came on a Sunday afternoon. Richard was in his basement office, reviewing his notes on Gerald Wilson for the 100th time when his cell phone rang. The display showed Lieutenant Washington's name. "Marcus," Richard answered, immediately alert. Washington rarely called unless there was something significant to discuss. "Richard," the detective's voice was carefully controlled. "There's been a development. I'm on my way to your house now. Is Martha home?" Richard's heart began to pound. "Yes, she's upstairs with Emily. What kind of development?" "I'd rather discuss it in person. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes were among the longest of Richard's life. He called Martha down to the living room, trying to keep his voice neutral to avoid alarming her unnecessarily. They sat side by side on the couch, holding hands, neither speaking the fear that hung in the air. After this many years, a development often meant remains had been found. When Washington arrived, they were surprised to see he was alone. No victim services counselor, no additional officers. That, at least, suggested they weren't about to receive the worst possible news. The detective sat across from them, his face grave but with something else in his expression, a tightly controlled excitement. "Gerald Wilson died 3 days ago," he said without preamble. "Heart attack. He was found in his garage by a neighbor who hadn't seen him for a couple of days." Richard and Martha exchanged confused glances. While Wilson had remained their private suspect for years, his death hardly seemed like a major development in Sarah's case. "I'm not sure I understand," Martha said cautiously. Washington leaned forward. The neighbor who found him, Mrs. Diaz, noticed something unusual while waiting for the paramedics. Wilson's German Shepherd, Rex, was behaving strangely around the backyard kennel, pawing at the wooden floor and whining. Out of curiosity, she looked inside and noticed one of the floorboards seemed loose. Richard felt a chill run down his spine, and Mrs. Diaz didn't investigate further at the time, but yesterday she called me directly and mentioned it. Given Wilson's history as a person of interest in Sarah's case, I obtained a warrant to search the property this morning. Washington paused, reaching into his jacket pocket. "We found this hidden in a metal box beneath the kennel floor." He placed a small pink hair clip on the coffee table between them, a plastic butterfly with rhinestones, weathered but still recognizable. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That was Sarah's. She was wearing it the day she disappeared." Richard couldn't tear his eyes away from the small object. What else was in the box? Washington's expression darkened. A collection of news clippings about Sarah's disappearance, and photographs, surveillance-type photos of your family taken over several years, some from before she vanished. The implications hit them like a physical blow. Wilson had been watching them, had potentially been stalking their family before he took Sarah. "We're executing a more thorough search of the property tomorrow morning, including ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs," Washington continued quietly. "I wanted you to hear this from me first, before we proceed." "I want to be there," Richard said immediately, "when you search." Washington hesitated, then nodded. "I can arrange that, but you'll need to stay with an officer at all times. And Richard," he met the father's eyes with a compassionate but firm gaze, "we don't know what we'll find. You need to be prepared for that." After Washington left, the house fell into a heavy silence. Emily, now 15, had been upstairs with headphones on, unaware of the detective's visit or its implications. Martha and Richard sat together, the the small butterfly clip now in Martha's palm, her fingers closed protectively around it. "After all these years," she whispered. "It was him. He was right there across the street watching us search and grieve and fall apart." Richard put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "We don't know everything yet, but we're finally going to get answers, Martha, one way or another." That night, neither of them slept. They lay awake, hands clasped, minds racing with possibilities both hopeful and horrific. The discovery of the hair clip didn't necessarily mean Sarah was dead. She could have lost it during a struggle, or Wilson might have kept it as a trophy while holding her somewhere else. But after nearly 8 years, they also had to face the possibility that the search would uncover their daughter's remains. How to tell Emily? What would this do to their daughter who had spent more than half her life without her twin? These questions tormented them as dawn approached, bringing with it the day that might finally reveal the truth about what happened to Sarah Keller. March 3, 2025 *. The Wilson property was cordoned off with yellow police tape, marked patrol cars parked outside. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the perimeter, watching as officials came and went from the unassuming ranch-style house. News vans were beginning to arrive, reporters setting up camera equipment across the street. Richard stood next to Lieutenant Washington, watching as a team with ground-penetrating radar equipment methodically moved across the backyard. Other officers were inside the house, conducting a thorough search of every room, every closet, every crawlspace. Cadaver dogs and their handlers waited nearby for their turn to examine the property. "How long will this take?" Richard asked, his voice raw from a sleepless night. Washington checked his watch. "The radar survey should be completed in about an hour. If they find anything suspicious, we'll start excavating immediately." Richard nodded, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the dog kennel, a simple wooden structure about 6 feet by 8 feet, with a hinged roof for access. The floorboards had been completely removed now, revealing the dirt beneath. The German Shepherd had been taken to an animal shelter temporarily. Did Wilson have any family? Anyone who might know if he had other properties, other places he might have? Richard couldn't finish the sentence. "No living relatives that we've found so far. He was divorced 30 years ago, no children. Retired from his job as a mechanic about 10 years ago, kept to himself mostly." Washington hesitated, then added, "We're checking financial records to see if he owned or rented any other properties." An hour crawled by, then 2. Richard remained standing, refusing offers of a chair or coffee, his eyes never leaving the search teams as they worked. Martha had stayed home with Emily, waiting by the phone for news. It was nearly noon when one of the radar technicians called Washington over, pointing at something on their equipment display. Richard followed, his heart in his throat. "We've got an anomaly here," the technician explained, indicating an area near the back fence about 15 feet from the kennel. "Consistent with disturbed soil, approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and beginning about 4 feet down." Washington's face remained professionally neutral, but his body tensed. "Let's bring in the excavation team." Richard felt his knees threaten to buckle. A 6-foot-long disturbance in the soil. The implications were unmistakable. Washington must have noticed his reaction because he gripped Richard's arm firmly. "Stay with me, Richard. We don't know what it is yet." The excavation was meticulous and agonizingly slow. Each layer of soil was carefully removed, sifted, and documented. Richard watched, barely breathing, as the hole grew deeper. 3 feet down, 3.5, 4. And then a shout from one of the workers. "We've got something." Richard surged forward, but Washington held him back. "Let them work, Richard, please." Minutes passed as the excavation team carefully exposed what they'd found. And then one of them straightened up, turning to Washington with a confused expression. "Lieutenant, you're going to want to see this." Washington approached the excavation site, peered down, and then turned to beckon Richard over. In the pit lay the rusted frame of a motorcycle, wrapped in what appeared to be a tarp. "It's not," Richard started, relief and confusion warring in his voice. "No," Washington confirmed. "It's not human remains. Looks like an old Indian motorcycle, probably vintage. Worth a lot of money if restored." The search continued throughout the afternoon, but the radar revealed no other significant anomalies. The cadaver dogs showed interest in a few areas: the kennel, a garden shed, the garage, but no conclusive alerts that would indicate human remains. Inside the house, officers found more disturbing evidence of Wilson's obsession with the Keller case. A hidden room behind a false wall in the basement contained a bulletin board covered with photos of the family, maps marking their regular routes, and journal entries detailing Wilson's observations of them over years. But nothing that definitively linked him to Sarah's abduction, and no indication of where she might be. By evening, Richard was exhausted, emotionally drained, yet still unwilling to leave until every inch of the property had been examined. Washington finally convinced him to go home to Martha and Emily, promising to call immediately if anything was discovered. "We'll continue searching tomorrow, Richard. The house still needs to be fully processed, and we're bringing in specialized teams for the basement and attic." Richard reluctantly agreed, driving home in a daze. The day had brought both validation of his long-held suspicions about Wilson and a new kind of torment, the knowledge that even in death, the man might keep his secrets. At home, Martha and Emily were waiting anxiously. Richard shared what had been found so far, carefully framing it for his teenage daughter who, despite her maturity, was still vulnerable when it came to her missing twin. "So we still don't know if he took her?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with the same mix of hope and fear her parents felt. "Not yet, honey," Richard said gently. "But the evidence shows he was very interested in our family and hiding something." That night, as they prepared for bed, Martha voiced the question that had been haunting her all day. "What if we never find her, Richard? What if Wilson took that knowledge to his grave?" Richard sat on the edge of their bed, staring at his hands. The same hands that had once swung a laughing Sarah up onto his shoulders, that had braided her hair and wiped away her tears when she scraped her knee. Hands that had failed to protect her. "I don't accept that," he said finally, his voice low and determined. "There will be something in that house, in his records somewhere, something that leads us to her." Martha touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that years of grief had etched there. "And if what we find breaks our hearts all over again?" He covered her hand with his own. "Then at least we'll know. At least we can stop searching and start truly mourning." March 4, 2025 *. Richard returned to the Wilson property at dawn. The search was continuing, now focused on the interior of the house. Forensic technicians moved methodically from room to room, dusting for fingerprints, photographing, collecting samples. In the kitchen, officers were removing cabinet drawers and examining the spaces behind them. In the living room, the carefully arranged model cars were being cataloged and checked for hidden compartments. In the basement, the false wall had been completely removed, exposing the small room that seemed to have served as Wilson's surveillance center for his obsession with the Keller family. Washington met Richard in the backyard, where a different team was now examining the dog kennel more thoroughly. The wooden structure had been completely disassembled, the dirt beneath it being carefully excavated and sifted. "Anything?" Richard asked, the single word containing volumes of hope and dread. Washington shook his head. "Nothing definitive yet, but the forensic team found something interesting in his bedroom, a key that doesn't match any locks in the house. We're trying to determine what it might open." As they spoke, one of the officers called out from the kennel excavation. "Lieutenant, I think we've got something here." Both men hurried over. The officer pointed to a small object partially embedded in the soil, a round plastic button, light pink in color. Richard's breath caught. That looks like one from the girls' dresses, the ones they wore that day. Martha made them herself." The area was immediately flagged, and a forensic technician called over to properly document and retrieve the item. As Richard watched, something about the pattern of the soil beneath where the button had been found caught his attention. "Wait," he said, crouching down despite Washington's cautioning hand on his shoulder. "There's something different about the soil here. It's a different color, a different texture." The forensic technician peered at the area Richard indicated. "He's right, Lieutenant. This soil has been disturbed and replaced. It's subtle, but once you see it." Washington immediately called for the ground-penetrating radar team to return and focus specifically on the area beneath where the kennel had stood. Within an hour, they had their answer. The radar showed a distinct anomaly about 3 feet down, smaller than the motorcycle burial, but definitely something that didn't belong naturally in the soil. The excavation began again, even more carefully than before. Richard refused to move from his position near the site, his eyes fixed on each shovelful of dirt that was removed. 2 feet down, 2.5, 3. And then a flash of something pink, fabric, partially decomposed but still recognizable. The same gingham pattern as the dresses Martha had sewn for the twins. Richard felt the world tilt around him, darkness crowding the edges of his vision. Washington gripped his arm firmly, supporting him as the excavation continued with exquisite care. What they eventually uncovered wasn't a body, but a small metal box, a safe deposit box or cash box, wrapped in what was indeed a piece of pink gingham fabric. The fabric appeared to have been cut from a larger garment, its edges irregular. The box was carefully removed and placed on a tarp nearby. It was locked, and suddenly the mystery key found in Wilson's bedroom took on new significance. Washington radioed for the key to be brought out, and tension mounted as they waited. When it arrived, all eyes were on the detective as he carefully inserted it into the lock of the box. It turned with a rusty click. Washington looked at Richard, a silent question in his eyes. Richard nodded, bracing himself for whatever might be inside. The detective lifted the lid. Inside lay several items, neatly arranged. A small diary with a flowered cover, a folded piece of paper, a child's bracelet made of colored beads, and a thumb drive. Richard recognized the diary and bracelet immediately. Those were Sarah's. The diary was a birthday present just a month before she disappeared, and she made that bracelet in school. Washington carefully removed the folded paper, opening it to reveal what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. It showed what looked like a rural area, with a crude house or cabin marked and roads or paths leading to it. At the bottom was written a series of numbers, possibly coordinates. "This could be a location," Washington said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Somewhere Wilson might have taken her." The thumb drive was bagged separately, to be examined under controlled conditions back at the station. It might contain photos or videos that would be difficult for a parent to see without preparation. Richard stared at the map, his mind racing. "It doesn't look like anywhere around here." "No," Washington agreed, "but those numbers might tell us exactly where it is." He turned to one of his officers. "Get this to the station immediately. I want these coordinates identified ASAP." To Richard, he said, "You should go home, tell Martha what we've found. I'll call as soon as we know where this location is." Richard felt torn, desperate to stay with the investigation as it unfolded, yet knowing Martha deserved to hear this news from him, not over a phone call. "You'll call the minute you know anything," he pressed. Washington nodded solemnly. "The very minute, Richard, I promise." Martha was in the kitchen when Richard arrived home, mechanically preparing a casserole though it was barely past noon. Cooking had become her therapy over the years, a way to maintain some semblance of normal family life, even when their family was irreparably broken. She looked up as he entered, reading his expression instantly. "What did they find?" Richard sat heavily at the kitchen table, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "A box buried under the dog kennel, with Sarah's things inside, her diary, the bracelet she made in art class, and a map, Martha, a map with coordinates." Martha's hands stilled, the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables suspended in midair. "A map to where?" "They don't know yet. They're working on it now." He reached for her hand. "But it's the first real lead in years. Washington thinks it might be a location where Wilson took her." Martha set the knife down carefully, wiped her hands on a towel, and sat across from Richard. "And if it is, after all this time, what do you think we'll find?" It was the question they'd been dancing around since Wilson's death, since the discovery of the hair clip, since the beginning of the search. What were they looking for after nearly 8 years? Their daughter alive, her remains, some other evidence of her fate. "I don't know," Richard admitted, "but whatever it is, we'll face it together, and we'll finally have answers." The wait for Washington's call was excruciating. Richard paced the house, unable to sit still, while Martha continued cooking with mechanical precision, the rhythmic chopping and stirring keeping her hands busy while her mind raced. Emily came home from school at 3:30, immediately sensing the charged atmosphere. "What happened?" she asked, looking from one parent to the other. They told her what had been found, carefully moderating their explanation. At 15, Emily was old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, but they still sought to shield her from the darkest possibilities. She listened silently, then asked the question they hadn't dared voice. "Do you think she might still be alive after all this time?" Richard and Martha exchanged a glance. "We don't know, sweetheart," Martha said gently. "It's been so long." "I think she is," Emily said with a certainty that startled them both. "I would know if she wasn't, I would feel it." Neither parent knew how to respond to this. The bond between twins was something they could observe but never fully understand. Had Emily maintained some connection to her sister all these years? Or was this simply the desperate hope of a child who'd never properly grieved? The call finally came at 6:12 p.m. Richard answered on the first ring, putting it on speaker so Martha could hear. "We've identified the location," Washington said without preamble. "It's a cabin in the Shenandoah Mountains, about 100 miles west of Cedar Brook. Property records show it was purchased by Gerald Wilson's father in the 1970s, then transferred to Gerald after his father's death in 2000. It doesn't appear in Wilson's current property records because he transferred ownership to a corporation he created, likely why we missed it in earlier investigations." "How soon can we get there?" Richard asked, already moving toward the door. "A team is assembling now," Washington replied. "We'll be ready to move in 30 minutes. I can pick you up on the way." Richard looked at Martha, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded. "I'm coming too." "Both of us," she said to Washington. "We need to be there." There was a brief pause then. "Understood, be ready in 30 minutes." As they prepared to leave, Emily watched them with wide, solemn eyes. "I want to come too," she insisted. Martha shook her head firmly. "No, sweetheart, we don't know what we're going to find. Your Aunt Carol is on her way over to stay with you." Emily's expression hardened with a determination that reminded them painfully of Sarah. "She's my twin. If she's there, I should be there too." Richard knelt before his daughter, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Emily, listen to me. Your mother and I need to do this first. If Sarah is there, if she's okay, we'll call you immediately. But if not, if what we find is difficult, we need to process it ourselves before you see it. Can you understand that?" Something in his tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation because Emily's resistance softened. "Promise you'll call me right away, no matter what." "I promise," Richard said, pulling her into a tight hug. "No matter what." The drive to the cabin was largely silent. Richard and Martha sat in the back of Washington's unmarked police car, holding hands, each lost in their own thoughts. Ahead of them and behind them drove additional police vehicles, uniformed officers, a forensic team, paramedics, preparing for any possibility. The sun was setting as they turned off the main highway onto a narrow forest road, the trees casting long shadows across their path. The road grew rougher as they climbed higher into the mountains, eventually becoming little more than a dirt track winding through dense forest. "According to the GPS, we're about half a mile from the cabin now," Washington informed them, breaking the long silence. "We'll stop here and approach on foot. I need you both to stay with Officer Reynolds at all times, understand? Let us secure the location first." They nodded mutely, the reality of what lay ahead finally sinking in. After almost 8 years of searching, of hoping and grieving and raging, they were possibly minutes away from learning their daughter's fate. The final approach was tense, officers moving stealthily through the trees with weapons drawn. Richard and Martha waited with Officer Reynolds, a compassionate woman who spoke to them softly, preparing them for what might come next. And then, through their earpieces, the officers heard the command from the team leader. "Cabin secured. No individuals present. Evidence of recent occupancy." The news sent a confusing mix of emotions through Richard and Martha. No one present could mean no Sarah. Either she had never been there, or had been there but was now gone, or had been there but was now dead. Recent occupancy, however, suggested someone had been living in the cabin, perhaps right up until Wilson's death 3 days ago. They were finally allowed to approach, still escorted by Officer Reynolds. The cabin came into view as they emerged from the trees, a small, weathered structure with a sagging porch and moss-covered roof. It looked abandoned at first glance, but as they drew closer, they could see the windows were intact and the door had a new, heavy-duty padlock. One of the officers had already broken the lock, and the door stood ajar. Washington met them before they could enter. "I need to prepare you," he said, his face grave. "There's evidence someone has been living here recently, a young person based on the items we've found, but there's no one here now and there are some disturbing elements. This may have been a captivity situation." Martha's hand flew to her mouth while Richard's jaw tightened. "Show us," he said simply. The interior of the cabin was sparse but functional. A main room served as both living area and kitchen with a small wood stove, a table and chairs, shelves stocked with canned goods. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom and another to a rudimentary bathroom. But the normality ended there. The windows had been reinforced with metal bars, disguised on the outside as decorative shutters. The main door had multiple locks, all on the outside. And in the bedroom, the bed frame had attachment points for restraints, though they weren't currently in use. "Someone was being held here," Washington confirmed, watching their reactions carefully. "But there are also signs of a more normalized situation, at least recently. Books, school supplies, personal items that weren't under lock and key." Martha moved slowly through the space, touching nothing but taking in every detail. A bookshelf held high school-level textbooks alongside young adult novels. A small desk was covered with papers, what appeared to be homework assignments. On the wall hung a calendar showing March 2025, with days neatly crossed off up to March 1st, the day before Wilson's death. And then she saw it, a photograph pinned to a corkboard above the desk. A teenaged girl with long blonde hair sitting on the cabin's porch, a German shepherd by her side. The girl's face was turned toward the camera, her expression solemn but not frightened. It was Sarah, older, her face having lost its childish roundness but unmistakably Sarah, and the photograph couldn't be more than a few months old. "Richard," Martha whispered, her voice breaking. "Look." He was beside her in an instant, staring at the photo with a mixture of shock, joy, and heartbreak. Their daughter alive, their daughter a teenager now, their daughter who had spent more than half her life as a captive in this remote cabin. "She's alive," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Or at least she was very recently." He turned to Washington. "We need to find her now. Wilson's dead, so where would she go?" Washington was already on his radio, calling for additional resources, helicopters, search teams with dogs. If she left on foot, she couldn't have gotten far in this terrain, unless someone picked her up. The forensic team was processing the cabin methodically, looking for any clue to where Sarah might have gone. One officer called Washington over to the desk, pointing to something in one of the notebooks. "Lieutenant, look at this. It appears to be a journal or diary, and there's an entry dated March 2nd, the day after Wilson's last calendar marking." Washington read aloud. "G didn't come today. He's never late. Something must have happened. I'm worried about Rex, but this might be my chance. The emergency key is still where he showed me. I think it's time." The implications were clear. Sarah had realized something was wrong when Wilson didn't arrive for his regular visit. She knew about an emergency key, presumably to the padlock on the cabin door, and had decided to escape. But where would a teenager go who had been held captive since she was 7? Who had likely been told lies about her family, about the outside world? Who might not even remember how to get back to Cedar Brook? As if in answer to these unspoken questions, Officer Reynolds called from the kitchen area. "Lieutenant, I think I found something." She was holding a map similar to the one they'd found in the buried box, but this one had additional markings. A route highlighted in yellow, leading from the cabin to what appeared to be a town about 20 miles away. "There's a bus station in Riverdale," Washington said, studying the map. "If she made it there." He immediately dispatched officers to the bus station with Sarah's description and the recent photo from the cabin. Other teams began searching the surrounding forest in case she was still making her way down the mountain. Hours passed in agonizing slowness. Richard and Martha remained at the cabin, unable to bring themselves to leave what had been their daughter's prison for so many years. They moved through the small space, touching her books, her clothes, trying to piece together the life she had lived in their absence. The schoolwork suggested Wilson had educated her, at least in basic subjects. The books showed diverse interests: science fiction, mysteries, even some classics. There were no personal photos of the Keller family, no mementos from her early childhood beyond the items Wilson had buried in that box. It was as if her life had been cleaved in two, with her first 7 years erased from this new existence. Martha found herself wondering what Sarah believed had happened. Had Wilson told her her family was dead, that they had abandoned her, or something even more twisted? Just after midnight, Washington's radio crackled to life. "Lieutenant, we've got confirmation from the bus station. A girl matching Sarah's description purchased a ticket 2 days ago, one way to Cedar Brook." Richard and Martha stared at each other in shock. "She was coming home," Martha whispered. "She was trying to find her way back to us." Washington was already moving. "We need to get back to Cedar Brook immediately. If she arrived, she might have gone to your old house, or she might be wandering the town, disoriented." The drive back was a blur, with Washington breaking every speed limit as they raced down the mountain and back toward Cedar Brook. Martha called her sister Carol, who was still with Emily, instructing her not to tell Emily anything yet, but to make sure all the doors were locked and to call immediately if anyone came to the house. "What if she doesn't remember us?" Martha asked suddenly, her voice small with fear. "What if she doesn't know who we are anymore?" Richard squeezed her hand. "She remembered enough to try to come home. That's all that matters right now." It was nearly 3 a.m. when they reached Cedar Brook. The town was quiet, streets empty, houses dark. Washington coordinated with the local police, who had begun a methodical search of the area, starting with the Kellers' old neighborhood. They had moved from that house 5 years ago, unable to bear the constant reminders of Sarah's absence. The new house was across town, in a neighborhood Sarah would never have known. If she had returned to Cedar Brook looking for her family, would she have gone to the old house first? Washington drove them to their former home, now occupied by a young couple with a baby. The lights were off, the house peaceful in the pre-dawn darkness. "We can wake them, ask if anyone has come looking," Washington offered. But before they could decide, his radio came to life again. "Lieutenant, we've got a possible sighting at Cedar Brook Memorial Park. Patrol officer reports a teenage girl sleeping on a bench near the playground." The park was less than a mile from their old house, a place the twins had played countless times in their early childhood. Hope surged through Richard and Martha as Washington flipped on his lights and sped toward the location. The patrol car was waiting at the park entrance, its officer standing by respectfully as Washington explained the situation. "She's still there," the young officer said. "Didn't want to approach until we had confirmation it might be the missing Keller girl. She seems wary." "Let us go," Martha said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Just Richard and me first, if it's Sarah, if she's scared." Washington nodded. "I'll be right behind you, but at a distance, take it slow." Hand in hand, Richard and Martha walked into the darkened park, guided by the patrol officer's directions to a bench near the swing sets. As they approached, they could make out a figure huddled under what appeared to be a jacket, curled into a defensive position even in sleep. They stopped about 10 feet away, uncertain how to proceed. "Wake her, call her name, what if she ran?" Martha took a deep breath, then spoke softly. "Sarah." The figure on the bench stirred, then sat up abruptly, immediately alert. In the dim light from distant street lamps, they could see it was indeed a teenage girl with long blonde hair, her face a hauntingly mature version of the 7-year-old they'd lost. She stared at them, her body tense, poised to flee. "Sarah," Richard said, his voice breaking. "It's us, Mom and Dad." The girl's eyes widened, her expression a complex mix of fear, hope, and disbelief. "You're alive," she whispered. The question broke Martha's heart. "Yes, sweetheart, we're alive. We've been looking for you for so long." Sarah stood shakily, still keeping her distance. "He said you were dead, that you died in a car accident and no one wanted me except him." Richard fought to keep his rage at Wilson contained, focusing instead on his daughter, his living, breathing daughter standing before them after 8 impossible years. "He lied, Sarah. We never stopped looking for you, not for one day." He took a tentative step forward, then stopped when she tensed. Your sister Emily is waiting at home. She's missed you so much. Emily, Sarah's voice caught on the name. She's alive too. Martha nodded, tears streaming freely down her face now. Yes, she's at home with your Aunt Carol. She's 15 now, just like you. Sarah seemed to be processing this information, her brow furrowed in concentration. I remembered this park and our old house, but different people live there now. I didn't know where to go. We moved a few years ago, Richard explained gently. But we're still in Cedar Brook. We have a room for you, Sarah. It's been waiting for you all this time. Sarah took a small step toward them, then another. How do I know you're really my parents? It's been so long. I can't remember your faces clearly anymore. Martha reached slowly into her pocket and withdrew her wallet. From it, she pulled a worn photograph, the last school picture taken of the twins before Sarah's abduction. This is you and Emily, she said, holding it out, just before you were taken. Sarah approached cautiously, stopping just within reach to peer at the photo. She studied it for a long moment, then looked up at Martha and Richard, searchingly. Something in their faces must have convinced her, because suddenly she was moving forward, collapsing into their outstretched arms. Mom, she sobbed, the word muffled against Martha's shoulder. Dad. They held her between them, this miracle they'd never stopped hoping for. All three weeping as 8 years of separation finally ended in a pre-dawn embrace beside a playground where two little girls had once laughed together. Behind them, Washington discreetly wiped his own eyes before radioing in. We've found her. Sarah Keller is alive and with her parents. 2 weeks later, the Keller home was quiet in the early morning light. In the kitchen, Richard prepared coffee while Martha made pancakes, Sarah's favorite breakfast as a child, and one she had shyly requested the day before. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of medical examinations, psychological evaluations, police interviews, and tearful reunions. Sarah had been hospitalized briefly for a thorough health assessment, which had found her physically healthy despite her ordeal. The psychological wounds, however, would take much longer to heal. The story Sarah told, pieced together in gentle interviews with specialists, was both better and worse than they had feared. Wilson had indeed taken her that day, luring her with a story about an injured puppy in his van. He had kept her initially in his basement's hidden room, then moved her to the cabin once the search intensity had diminished. He had told her that her family had died, showing her fake newspaper articles he had created as proof. He had controlled every aspect of her life, keeping her restrained in the early years until she had been thoroughly conditioned to obey. Later, as she entered adolescence, he had allowed her more freedom within the confines of the isolated cabin, even teaching her from textbooks and providing books to read. There had been no sexual abuse, a mercy that Martha and Richard clung to in their darkest moments. Wilson's obsession had been more complex, more twisted in other ways. He had created an alternate reality in which he was Sarah's rescuer and protector, the only person who cared for her in a dangerous world. It had only been in the last year that Sarah had begun to question his stories. Small inconsistencies, memories that didn't match his narrative, and her own developing critical thinking had led her to secretly doubt. She had been planning an escape for months, memorizing the location of the emergency key he kept hidden, studying the maps he occasionally left out, observing the routine of his visits. When he failed to arrive on his regular day, she had seized the opportunity, making her way down the mountain to the bus station, and using money she had gradually pilfered from his wallet over many months to buy a ticket home, though she had only the vaguest memories of where home had been. Now home was becoming familiar again. Emily and Sarah had reconnected with the tentative wonder of strangers who nonetheless recognized something of themselves in each other. They no longer looked identical. Different experiences had shaped their faces and bodies in subtle ways, but the bond between them was rebuilding day by day. Pancakes are ready, Martha called softly up the stairs. Girls. A moment later, Emily appeared, followed more hesitantly by Sarah. This had become their morning ritual, Emily leading, Sarah following, a reverse of their childhood dynamic that somehow felt right for now. As they gathered around the table, Richard caught Sarah's eye and smiled. She smiled back, a small expression, still cautious but genuine. It was a beginning. Later, as the girls sat together in the living room, Martha found Richard in his office. staring at the wall where maps and timelines and theories had once been pinned. It was empty now, the desperate search finally over. "What are you thinking?" she asked, slipping her arms around him from behind. He covered her hands with his own. That were the lucky ones. So many families never get answers, never get their children back. Martha rested her cheek against his shoulder. "She has a long road ahead, we all do." "But we'll walk it together," Richard said, turning to face her. "All four of us." From the living room came a sound they hadn't heard in 8 years, Sarah's laugh, sparked by something Emily had said. It was different than the laugh of the 7-year-old they'd lost, deeper, more hesitant, carrying the shadows of all she'd endured. But it was unmistakably her laugh, a sound they had feared they would never hear again. Martha and Richard stood in the doorway, watching their daughters together on the couch, heads bent over a photo album. Emily was pointing to pictures, explaining events that had happened during the years of separation, while Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking questions or touching a photo with wonder. They were healing, this family that had been broken for so long. The scars would always remain, in Sarah's wariness around older men, in Emily's protective hovering, in Martha's sleepless nights checking that both girls were safe in their beds, in Richard's occasional, overwhelming rage at the man who had stolen 8 years of their lives. But they were together. Against all odds, despite the passage of years, despite the twisted machinations of a disturbed mind, they were together. And in that togetherness lay the possibility of a future none of them had dared imagine just 3 weeks ago. Sarah looked up and caught her parents watching. For a moment, the years fell away, and they saw a flash of the 7-year-old in her eyes, curious, loving, fully present. "Hey," she said softly, "come see these pictures with us. Emily's showing me all the things I missed." Richard and Martha joined their daughters on the couch. The photo album spread across their laps, the past and present merging as they began the long, healing process of becoming a family once again. Detective Washington, driving past the Keller home on his way to headquarters, slowed as he approached. Through the front window, he could see them, all four together, heads bent over something on the coffee table, a family made whole against impossible odds. In his 23 years of law enforcement, cases like Sarah Keller's were vanishingly rare. Most children missing for that long were never found alive. Most families never got their miracle. He offered a silent prayer of gratitude as he continued down the street. In a world often dark with human cruelty, the Kellers' reunion was a reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, light could break through even the deepest shadows. And in a house that had known too much grief, two sisters, once identical, now individual, but forever connected, began the delicate process of rediscovering each other, while their parents watched over them with the fierce, protective love that had never wavered through 8 long years of searching. Sarah was home. Against all odds, Sarah was home.